You have already been introduced a little bit to Chinua Achebe through his very famous essay, A New Image of Africa. But to understand how he got to that particular essay, it's worth knowing a little bit about his background, which will help make sense of why he sort of said what he said in that particular piece, but also why he's going to do what he's going to do in his book, Things Fall Apart, which we're starting tonight. So we'll start with a little bit of his biography. Achebe was born in 1930 in Ogidi, Nigeria. And what's really important to know is that he was part of the Igbo ethnic group, or Igbo. You'll also see it sometimes IGBO, but it's the same group. He did end up moving to the United States for school. And so you'll see his date there, died in Boston in 2013. Back in Nigeria, he attended a Christian school that was modeled on British public schools. So already he grew up very much under the influence of sort of the effects of colonization. He began writing while he was at university. Again, that university there was founded on sort of British models. He became a teacher and then also began working for the Nigerian Broadcasting Service. And this would have been in the 50s, so in his early 20s. That's what he was doing. And he was traveling all through Nigeria at that time. But as he began teaching, his focus was in literature. And increasingly, he became disillusioned with what he sort of saw as the European portrayal of Africa. He thought it was unrealistic and that it was sort of condescending. So he believed that there was a necessity for people from Africa to publish their own literature that would sort of would counteract this. His first novel was Things Fall Apart. It was published in 1958. He went on to publish other things, but Things Fall Apart would always be considered his masterpiece. He began teaching at various universities, and that included moving throughout the world. He was in Britain for a while before moving to the United States, where he would teach for the majority of his career. He is known, believe it or not as an author. In the literature world, he is also known as a literary scholar. In particular, he was one of the men who pioneered what we've talked about, post-colonial theory. And that's where, when you read A New Image of Africa, it's very clear that he is writing from that perspective. He is writing with a post-colonial bent, because that's what he was sort of lived growing up. He was experiencing this sort of post-colonial effects in his own country. This is something, Achebe, this is from a different article that he wrote, but something that he was very famous for was he really believed in the necessity of creating what he called African literature. So literature about Africa, but that was by Africans, which the world didn't have for many, many, many centuries. And so his quote here, we have the last 400 or 500 years of European contact with Africa produced a body of literature that presented Africa in very bad light and Africans in very lurid terms. The reason for this had to do with the need to justify the slave trade and slavery. This continued until the Africans themselves, in the middle of the 20th century, took into their own hands the telling of their story. And Achebe's belief that Africans need to tell their own story actually was very rooted in the culture that he grew up in. This is a very famous proverb in the Igbo culture. It says, until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. So his post-colonial theory was basically that in the United States we have history is told by the victor. And so this was basically what he was seeking to rectify. He said the hunt, or the sort of Africa and the colonial impact, needs to be told by the lions, not the hunters. And in some ways it makes sense. History is always going to be told to sort of benefit the people who are doing the telling. And so his work really sought to create a way that Africans could do the telling in ways that felt more authentic, which led to one of his major conflicts. Achebe went to English language schools. English is one of the national languages of Nigeria. So he wrote in English. And in some ways, it's beneficial for us. AP Lit requires that we read mostly books that were written in English natively and are not in translation, which is why we get to read Achebe, because he wrote Things Fall Apart in English. However, he was criticized for this. Where he was born, his family spoke Igbo. He learned English through school, and English obviously came to Nigeria through colonization. So a lot of people felt like he was using the very language or culture that he was criticizing. Achebe explained that because Nigeria had so many different languages, and there's 63 spoken languages in Nigeria, that English was the most common. However, he did acknowledge that some ideas, some things are so African that they could not be adequately conveyed through English. And this is one of the problems with language in general. It is a reflection of the culture. And because of that, certain cultural ideas don't translate. So you're going to see in Things Fall Apart that he relies heavily on Igbo storytelling. So there will be a lot of this sort of traditional stories, legends, and proverbs that are used because they're the closest for what he's trying to say. Because he's not using the Igbo language, he's going to at least use some of their sort of storytelling traditions to give it a sense of authenticity, he claimed. You'll also see, it says the use of oratorical. Oratorical refers to giving a speech. And that is actually a really important part of African philosophical sort of tradition, is the idea of speaking. That's how a lot of their legends and their stories and their proverbs are passed on. So you'll see in Things Fall Apart this reliance on people orally conveying information or giving long speeches because that's a part of their culture. We're going to come back to this sort of controversy around Achebe and language, and we'll read some of the people who disagreed with him. Because while it seems natural that he wrote in English, there's another side to this, and that is that he was very much using the language of the elite. Only those who were wealthy learned English at school. Those who couldn't attend British schools didn't learn it. So English, while it is a national language, it is definitely a language that leaves out a large majority of the people living in Nigeria they just don't have access to it. They don't know it. And so one of the criticisms becomes, who is Achebe writing for? Is he writing for, with African literature, is he writing for Africans or is he writing for Europeans? And that's something we'll talk about as we read and as we look at some people who took the opposite stance from Achebe. And this is from an article where Achebe talks about the need for African literature, but also why he wrote in English. He said, I believe in the complexity of the human story and that there's no way you can tell that story in one way and say, this is it. Always there will be someone who can tell it differently, depending on where they are standing. This is the way I think the world's story should be told, from many different perspectives. Here again, you see that post-colonial. Remember back that we talked about the idea of essentialism, the idea that one experience can somehow stand in for a vast majority of people. And this is what Achebe is really arguing against. And you're going to see that in some ways when we read Things Fall Apart, his main character, whose name is Okonkwo, is very much a reflection of his culture, but he's very much outside of it too. And so it's important to remember that Okonkwo doesn't stand for all Igbo people. He is an individual living in a particular culture. And sometimes students have a tendency to want to say that he is, all Africans are like this, or all Igbo are like this. And it's important to remember that even within the story, not even all of Okonkwo's family are like him. So to remember him as an individual and not sort of a representation of all people. Frequently, when we talk about this, we find that Nigeria's history, especially 20th century history, is perhaps a little fuzzy to some people. So we need to review this just to sort of clarify some of what you're going to see in the novel. So Nigeria, there are 3 major ethnic groups. This is by all means not all of them. As we said, there's over 60 languages and ethnic groups. But the 3 major that you'll see are the Igbo or Igbo in the east, which if you look here, these are going to be the groups up here, which is where our story is going to be set. We have the Hausa in the north, which would be up here. And then the most famous, the one that sort of the West is the most familiar with, is the Yoruba. They live in the West, and the reason the Yoruba are the most famous are because they live along the border here, which means when Westerners came in, the Yoruba was their sort of first contact. The British colonized Nigeria in the time the book is set. It's the late 19th century, so we're going to see the British have arrived, but they haven't made it all the way up to where the Igbo live. So this is right around the turn of the century, and you're going to see the first contact with the British happen in our story. In the 50s and 60s, we see nationalism take over Nigeria. Remember, this is when Achebe is first writing. He leaves university as this nationalism takes over. And in 1956, we see the first riots for African freedom. They do gain their independence very quickly after that in the 1960s. And then very shortly after, a civil war erupts that we are still feeling the effects of, where Biafra, which is a province, sought its independence from the rest of Nigeria. It was briefly independent. It no longer is. So we have a history then of sort of military control and dictatorship and instability. There was a long period in the early 2000s, I shouldn't say long, but a period of sort of stability. But now we're seeing splinter groups again. If you've watched the news and you've seen Boko Haram talked about. So once again, Nigeria is sort of struggling, in particular Boko Haram is very strong sort of in this middle of the country is where their stronghold is. But once again, we're seeing sort of the instability, and a lot of the issues come back to this sort of fracturing of Nigeria that happened during colonization. All of these areas that you see here are British created. So these were the British provinces, and as you guys have talked about in history classes, the provinces definitely caused some issues with where they were drawn, and we're still dealing with the effects of that in Nigeria today. So let's talk about things fall apart. It is the story of Okonkwo. You should know how to say that name. He is a warrior who is struggling to overcome his father's poor reputation. We'll talk a little bit more about why his father has that reputation as we get into the book. It's a character study, which means that while there definitely is a plot and events that happen, what is really important in this book is understanding sort of those layers of character and how Okonkwo changes throughout the story. So when we talked in Hamlet about the different ways to look at character, hopefully you remember those 4 methods, because that will be very important with Okonkwo's character. It will deal with the idea of conflict between Africa and Europe, but more specifically with the idea of tradition versus change, because Europe brought in that change. But we will not see our first sort of European settlers in the novel until about halfway through. So it is more the story of sort of Okonkwo at odds with a changing society in general. Names are one of the things that cause people the most problems. So we're going to end by saying this is a sort of phonetic way to say names, but in general, just pronounce all the letters. So we have, for example, your main character, Okonkwo. You have his oldest son. So again, say all the letters. Nwoyi, Izinma. You have Ikemefuna. This is the name that gives people the most problems. So Ikemefuna. Uchendu, Unoka, who is his father. Obierka, his best friend. And then we have Ikefwi. So again, if you can just say all the letters, you're pronouncing it correctly. So again, really quick, because you need to say their names correctly. We have Okonkwo, Nwoyi, Izinma, Ikemefuna, Uchendu, Unoka, Obierka, and Ekwefi. Pronounce those names a couple times so that when we start reading, you're able to talk about them correctly.